Welcome to this Academy for Teachers Masterclass on telling stories out of school with Seth Barrish. My name is Ashra Gupta and I've been teaching for 12 years. I teach science at Harvest Collegiate High School right near Union Square. And I love what I do because I feel like schools are a chance for people to create communities. We come together, we try to build the world as we like it to be. I'm a proud fellow of the Academy for Teachers, an organization that always reminds me just how brilliant teachers are and can be. And during this incredibly difficult year, I feel like the Academy has really found ways to help us to connect, learn, grow. And I feel like the Academy is not simply about professional development, but really thinks about how we can share the stories, struggles, and expertise of teachers. Today, I have the honor of introducing Seth Barrish. Seth has been a professional acting coach and teacher for more than 3 decades. An award-winning actor, director, and artistic director, he has spent years honing and sharing techniques to maximize spontaneity and bring performances to life. In 1986, he co-founded the Barrow Group, a company that has left an indelible mark on the New York theater scene. He has worked with, among others, Hathaway, Mike Birbiglia, and Hale. I am so looking forward to this class. My subject might be science, but I think stories and performance are an essential part of every classroom. I'm super excited to learn from Seth and to discover the stories that all of us carry, because we do all carry stories. Indeed, Seth is not the only star of this master class. It is also my honor to introduce the 11 teachers that are here today. This is an impressive group with advanced degrees in chemistry, education, English language arts, creative writing, studio art, and American literature. We teach grades 4 through 12 and early college in public schools, charter schools, and independent schools. We teach a big range of subjects: world literature, studio art, climate justice, film. We include special educators, artists, coaches. We spend our time outside the classroom making all kinds of clubs and extracurriculars happen: camping trips, philosophy club, lacrosse, a board game design club. There's a lot of teaching experience here today. We've been in the classroom between 4 and 52 years. In total, the number of years we've been teaching here in this Zoom room is 167.
Wow.
We teach between 40 and 150 kids. The number of children who know our names is 937, and that's this year alone. So your real audience today, Seth, is those 937 kids and the 1,000 students that we'll have next year, and the next, and the year after that, because every teacher here will, in some way, share with them what we learn here today from you. The ripple effect of a master class is huge. Thank you, Mr. Barrish, for being here. Thanks to my fellow teachers for teaching. And with that, let the master class begin. Seth.
I feel like the last time I was called Mr. Barrish must have been 30 years ago.
We're all teachers here.
I just want to mention as we start that, first of all, do not be surprised if you see a tear or two rolling down my cheek. Both of my parents were teachers. And this, when every time Sam sets up one of these with me, this is just very near and dear to my heart. Mike Birbiglia and I did a joint workshop. I don't even know time. The pandemic just messed with time in my head, but I feel like it was a year or 2 ago, something like that. And I was blown away by how good everybody was at storytelling. And then when I think at all about that and what goes on when you're teaching and how you're constantly communicating to groups of people and everything, and in a situation where you're also have a desire to hold people's interest, it makes total sense. So I'm thrilled to be doing this. What I was thinking that we would do today is I'll go over an approach to story structure, and I actually have a video that's about 10 minutes long that I'm going to have y'all watch, and then we'll as we get key in on this approach to story structure, we'll practice identifying story structure points in plays or movies or stories that we're all familiar with. And that'll be like today's, exercise. And then for our next 2 sessions, you all will be preparing, I think, like 3-minute stories that you can come in and share with us, and we'll kind of go through that and talk about, the structure of those, and also ways to possibly punch things up. And that's a comedy term. Some of you are probably well familiar with it, some of you may not be, but it just means make things more impactful in some ways. Awesome. So without any further ado, I think I'm going to have you guys watch this video. So I'm going to share the screen, and let me just do that. Okay. And you all see in the big black rectangle at this point?
Yep. Yes. Yeah.
Alrighty, here you go.
Yeah.
Hi there. Here's a short lesson on how to craft a story. I'm thinking the best way to start might be to listen to a good story, so here's one from Mike Birbiglia.
We went to this place called Katmai National Park, which is one of these places that has so many bears that when you arrive, they take you to what's called bear orientation. And they teach you, and it seems counterintuitive, but if you ever see a bear walking towards you, you're actually supposed to clap and make the bear aware of your presence. Like, I'm right here, bear. I'm right here. I'm Mike, and you're a bear. And we're okay with each other. And when they told me this, I was like, oh, I'm going to be murdered by a bear. Because that seems like basting yourself in barbecue sauce. It's like, I'm right here, bear. I'm right here. And I taste fantastic. I've applied condiments so that I'll be less bland. Patty and I went fly fishing. I don't know if you've ever tried this, but it's much more difficult than it looks, and a river runs through it. We're waist deep in water. We're in the rubber pants, and there are salmon jumping out of the water in front of us, literally jumping, which is what I would do if I were a fish. That seems like a great field trip. You're in the boring water all day, and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, I want to stay here and grow legs and become a human, which is what happened over time. Sorry, homeschoolers. Here's where it heats up. I'm with the fishing guide. My sister Patty's about 75 yards behind us. And I hear her say, Mike? And it was the voice of someone who was about to be mauled. It had a very distinct pitch, It was like, Mike? Like right here, she thought there might be a bear. Right here? That's a bear. If she knew the whole time, it'd just be like, Mike! And I turn around, and there's an 8-foot brown bear walking towards her in the water. It was very surreal because he wasn't running, He wasn't like, I will murder you. Ah! He was just kind of docile, like, I'm a bear, etc. Well, here it was, my greatest fear my entire life, and I was proud of myself because I built up the courage to say, Guide, do something! And that guide snapped into action. He sprinted over in the water right at the bear, and he goes, yeah, yeah, yeah! And the bear walks away. He was just like, all right, I'm a bear, etc. And I was very relieved that my sister didn't get mauled. But in retrospect, I was a little angry at the guide. I was like, you didn't tell me about the plan. You just told me to go, I'm right here, bear, I'm right here. And my name is Mike. It's like he gave me the bad parachute, like everybody's chute goes off, and then I have the multicolored gym class parachute. I'm like, this doesn't do anything! Except build team skills!
So let's look at a picture of story structure. Here's a drawing with all the parts of a story on it. As you can see in the picture, there's a gray arrow in the background. That's a timeline. It's measuring the time of the telling of the story. In other words, as you tell the story, you're moving along this timeline. Once upon a time, blah, 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 until you get to the end. As you can see in the drawing, the first section of the story is the setup. This is the part that orients the audience. It gives them their bearings and lets them know what world they are in, who are the characters, just some basic information. Some people call this part of the story the norm, or the status quo, or the world, or the context, or the orientation. They all describe the same thing. Here's what's going on. Now let's get on with the story. In Mike's story, he goes to Katmai National Park with his sister in hopes of finding bears. And then something happens. The next part of a story is called the inciting incident. That's a technical term, but it also goes by a lot of different names. It's the first extraordinary thing that happens in the story. The part that hooks an audience in. Some people call it that, the hook. They also call it the tear because it rips the normal world apart, or the dilemma because some sort of dilemma is introduced, or a mystery or a challenge, something that makes the story move forward. Some people call it the Passover question, as in, why is this night different than any other night? Some people call it page 10, which is really a prompt, a reminder to the storytellers or writers to get to the part of the story that hooks people in soon. If you wait too long before getting to the inciting incident, the audience might check out. They're waiting for something to happen, and if nothing does, they might think this is not worth my while. So the idea is you want to get to it pretty quickly. The inciting incident of Mike Birbiglia's story is when he finds out he's at risk of being mauled by bears, which reminds me of another nickname for this part of the story, the bum 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 moment. Some people actually call it that. I do sometimes. The story continues, and it builds until it gets to the next pillar in story structure, the point of no return. The part of the story where things really escalate, and the audience wonders, how will this possibly work out? There's no going back, and maybe there's no going forward. In Mike's story, this happens when the bear approaches Patty. Oh no, she might get mauled. And then something big happens. The climax. This is the point of the entire story. Everything leads up to this moment. It's sometimes called the high point, or the big cheese, or the main event. It's the big thing that happens at the end. In Mike's story, the guide saves the day in an unexpected way. And that brings us to the denouement, also called the end, or the wrap-up, or the wind-up, or the strings, a nickname derived from Hollywood's treatment of this part of the story, where they swell the orchestra. It's a point where we process what happened in the climax. In Mike's story, this is when he points out that the guide did not train him properly, and it was like he gave him the gym class parachute. I find it's a good practice to pick out story elements from other people's stories, watch a story, hear it, and see if you can identify the inciting incident, the point of no return, and the climax. I'm going to share with you some techniques to pick out the climax, because the climax typically has certain characteristics. The climax almost always happens right towards the end. Certainly that's the case in Mike's story. The guide saves the day in the end. It also marks a significant change in the course of action, meaning one thing is happening throughout the story, and then we get to the climax, and now things are very different. Throughout Mike's story, there's a risk of a bear altercation, but now that the guide has saved the day, it's not a problem. Often the climax of a story will have a reveal, where something is made known to a character or to the audience, or both, information that was previously hidden. When the guide charges the bear, Mike and the audience find out for the first time about the Hia plan. Some climaxes are marked with an extreme physical event. Someone is murdered, or someone is attacked, or perhaps something is destroyed, or someone starts crying hysterically. In this case, the guide charging the bear and screaming Hia might count. And finally, one of the best identifiers for main events or climaxes is this question. If you were to end the story just after the climax occurs, would it be the same? Does anything happen after this climactic moment that's essential? Or can you end the story now? If you can end it now, you may well be at the climax. Once the guide charges the bear and saves the day, the story is basically over. We don't have Mike's funny commentary on the event, but we do know what happened. For all practical purposes, the story is done. So, there you go. You now know how stories are structured and some ways to identify main events. The next step is for you to create a story. Go ahead. The world awaits.
Alrighty. All right. Very nice. So there you go. So I thought that would be a good reference point for us to start our discussion together today. And maybe a good way to jump in would be to ask if anybody has any questions about what you just saw, the content of that and story structure and all that. You got it. Yeah, does it seem clear? Is there anything that you find yourself at all confused about or wondering about with, in anything that you just saw there? Okay, and another question, since you're teachers, and some of you I heard were English teachers and stuff, do you have any questions about how that particular system and approach lines up with systems that you're also familiar with and from other forms or other modalities?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So in the story that we just watched, or the story structure, it was a big event. Like, to me, it's a big event, like avoiding death, by being mauled from a bear. But can we use the same format in something less, not dramatic, but less like not life-threatening, but basically less life-threatening or big like that?
Absolutely. The idea is that the structure is not something that you even have to necessarily think about using. It's more that it's something that exists in all stories. I'll give you an example. Do any of you you've all lived lives. Does anybody have something that happened to them in the course of their life that's particularly fun to talk about? It might be one of the stories that you often tell at a dinner party or something, back when we had those. Anybody have something that happened to them that was kind of like this mind-blowing thing that happened to them? Anybody got one that you could share with us? Could be from your youth, could be from your travels.
Sure, I'll volunteer.
Great. What do you got?
So about 6 years ago at this point, my sisters and I went hiking in Norway through the fjords. And we're all hikers, like we go to the Adirondacks. So we're like, yes, we are experienced. At the time I was more fit than I am now, but we do this. So we thought we were prepared for this like Norwegian fjord experience, and like we were not. And just there were moments where like we were worried that we might not survive this, but there were also just these like little victories. And that's always the thing that like when we're together, we start telling these stories and people around us are like, what? Because we all play off each other and we all have our lines and we all have our moments that we jump in. Yeah.
Good. Now I'm going to, from that mine, a particular story. So these incidents you're talking about, like we all have these moments. Can you just tell us, because we weren't there, can you tell us the story of one of such incident, of something that happened?
Yes. So we had this guidebook called Walking Through Norway that was written by a British woman named Connie. And like the whole trip, we were just like, we hate you, Connie, because she would be like, today's hike is a delight. And then we'd start walking and like, she's like, this should take you 4.5 hours. And like, whatever she said, it would take us double plus 2 hours. So if she said 4.5, like it took us like 11 hours. And, everybody else on the trail was like Norwegian or German, and they were just kind of like plowing through, and we would take forever. So Connie just made everything seem like, this is wonderful. Enjoy this, this is a delight. But the only thing she said was, this hike we were on, that if it is raining on day 4, she said it will be treacherous. And that was like the strongest word she used. So we were just like, oh, it better not be raining on day 4 because we're really struggling as it is. And then my youngest sister every day was like, what happens if it's raining on day 4? Because we had train tickets that took us back to Oslo, and then we had a flight and we were going home. So like things had to line up. But I was like, we'll get there, we will worry about that the night of day 3. Like, we cannot worry about that on day 1. We cannot worry. So every day she'd be like, what about day 4? And like, I turned, we all like took our birth order rules very seriously on this trip. So I was like, we will talk about that on the night of day 3. And of course, like the night of day 3, we get to the lodge and they have this guy who's a baker and a shepherd and a weatherman, just kind of like sitting there at the front, and everyone would be like, oh, you know, they'd be like, ask the farmer. And I'm like, who's the farmer? And he's like, I'm also the farmer. So he was like, yes, it's going to rain tomorrow. And we were like, oh shit, it's going to be treacherous. So then a lot of things happened that night, including my one sister got diarrhea and there was thunder and lightning. Like it was real bad. But we woke up in the morning and my youngest sister, Jen, the one who had been so worried about the rain this whole time, was like, everything's gonna be okay, I think, because she's like, I feel better because I had this dream. And in the dream, Obama came in a taxi and picked us up and brought us home. And she's like, I feel so much better. And my sister Julie and I were like, really? Like that's what made you feel better? And she was like, yeah, you know, like I can't figure out what it represents or anything, but it was like I had this dream and I just woke up feeling good. And we're like, well, it represents that we get out. Like we're gonna get out. You had this dream, and she was like, oh, is that what it means? We were both like, yes, obviously. So then that whole day was truly treacherous. There was like fog, literal pea soup thickness. You know, you always hear about that and then you don't see it, but like you can't see your hand, fog. And there were, you know, waterfalls where you're like, is it raining or am I under a waterfall? You couldn't tell, but we made it out. And then I kind of like held my family together to the bottom of this hike. And then I completely fell apart as soon as we got off the trail. And my sisters really had to carry me through to get from like the end of the trail to the place we were sleeping that night. But we made it. And so now whenever we're together, like if something's tricky, we're just like, don't worry, Obama's coming in a taxi. Like, we're going to be okay.
All right, very good. So there's the story that you just told about this event that happened in your travels. And we're going to analyze it for story structure. And I think you're going to find that all the story structure points are in place kind of automatically. So in the story that Chris just told, is that how you pronounce your name, by the way? Is it Chrissy?
Chrissy, yeah.
Chrissy, okay, great. In the story that Chrissy just told us, what was the story of what happened on this one particular 4th day hike? What was the setup part of her story? What was the part that just was orienting us?
The book.
There's a book.
Well, the book warning us about what happens on the 4th day.
Possibly, although I would say that there was stuff before that was.
Oh, right, the trip to Norway too.
Yeah, she's on a trip. She's on a trip. She's in Norway. We have the locale. We have some idea what she's doing there. Great. And then we're introduced to a possible problem. And I think that's where your book comes in, because the book has this thing that says, you know, watch out if there's day 4, there's rain, you're in trouble, right? And I think that's the first hint we have of the story that, uh-oh, something is up. So that would become the inciting incident. Now, I realize that there are other incidents in the book that happen that are, you know, big and arguably bigger events than that. But the inciting incident has to do with where it is in the story. It's a structural concept. So it's really the first time that something is introduced where the audience goes, uh-oh, problem, right? My guess is that that's where y'all sense that we're going to hear a story about something that happened on 4th day, I think. Was that your experience hearing when she told the story? Everybody, did you start to kind of get, that's certainly my little spidey sense went off when I went 4th day, something's going to happen, right? And so that becomes your inciting incident. And then she told a bunch of stuff, and now we could identify the point of no return. But before we do that, I'm going to suggest that we identify the climax, because when you hear somebody else's story or read it or see it or whatever, it's often much easier to identify the climax, because the climax is the big thing that happens at the end. And then once you identify it, you can then go back through the story, sort of rewind through it to go like, well, what happened just before that? And that's usually that point of no return part. So what was the climax of her story? What was the big thing that happened at the end?
Well, so this is the part that I'm a little bit like, does the climax count as the Obama dream, or as the actual like treacherous pea soup hike? Because that, I think, sort of matches more of the things that you gave as the characteristics of a climax, right? That it's like, it's towards the end, there's a thing, but then the Obama dream also has this sort of change in how they're feeling about it all. So it felt like sort of like there were two little peaks there.
Yeah. Well, you could look at it that way. I'm going to suggest that I think the second one, if you're just following the guidelines of those criterion that at the end of the video where I was talking about how to identify the main event, the second one probably would satisfy overall the main event, although the dream also satisfies many of those identifiers, which brings me such a natural segue to a concept. So to get this across, I just need to have a piece of paper. So hang on one second, I'm going to get a piece of paper. Okay. So so this thing that I drew, this is just that story structure thing that you saw in the video, right? And you got this thing is the timeline of the telling of the story. And these are those structural points that, you know, the setup, and then the inciting incident, and the point of return, and the climax, and then the, you know, the denouement or the end, right? And that's picture of story structure. Now, if you were to magnify a portion of this line, so I'm just gonna, I'm gonna draw a representation of a magnification of just this thing in this circle, right? And what that would look like, another piece of paper for this. It's something akin to this. That's a magnification of that line. And what you can see is that there's actually a bunch of little mini stories within the overall structure of that line, right? I'm going to separate them for a second to make it more clear. Those are those same story things separated. You all see that?
Okay.
And so that dream thing might be one, and I would say it is, it's like a peak moment of one of the stories in the internal stories. But the thing that would help you determine whether that end bit matters or not, whether it's the climax or not, would be the question. It's that question on that list that is, can you end the story before that and it's the same story? In other words, if she had told the exact same story, and then her sister had the dream, and Obama was going to save her in a taxi, and they interpreted the dream, and she said the end, you can ask the question, is that substantively the same story as the story that includes the part about them actually going on the thing and it being treacherous and her getting out and her having a big breakdown? And if you felt like, well, yeah, that other stuff, it's the same story, then arguably the dream becomes the climax. If you feel like, well, we need that, that's a little different, then that becomes the climax, because structurally it's closer to the end and it's an essential part of the story. Y'all follow that?
Yeah, I do.
I just want to go back to one thing that always blows my mind about this concept. This is that drawing I just drew, right? Does that look like anything you're familiar with?
An EKG?
Yeah. That's exactly right. Blows my mind. It's so interesting that, here's this technical analysis of a story and you draw a picture of it and all of a sudden it looks like a heartbeat. which is, while that's kind of just fascinating to me anyway, from a sort of synchronistic sense, a sense of, wow, all things are connected and they reappear in these similar forms. It also is kind of reminding us that these little storylets along the way are basically the pulse of the story. They're the things that kind of are keeping things going and helping, your audience experience the forward momentum, and even as a storyteller, helping you experience the forward momentum. It's like, let me tell this part. Okay, now let me tell this part. Okay, now let me tell this part. And each one of those having its little mini climax. So does that make sense, Ashra, about why I would argue that in this particular story, that last bit becomes the climax, even though the dream was a climactic event?
Yeah, absolutely.
100%. Yeah.
It's also, it's relevant on a couple of levels, because sometimes you might either write, create, or tell a story, or even hear a story, and a thing along the way may hit you particularly hard. You might think, this is the biggest thing to me about this story, right? And yet you're continuing, or if you're telling it, or if you're hearing it, it's like, but the story's going on. And that allows you to, if you're on the crafting side of things, if you're telling a story, you get to make the decision, like, is this the big thing? And if it is the big thing, then you can make the choice, all right, we're going to end it here. And if it's like, no, there's more, then you make the choice to go on. And in this case, Chrissy, you were just asked to sort of spontaneously tell a story. There isn't a whole lot of crafting going on. One of the things I think that demonstrates is that story structure is just something inherent to stories. When you tell a story, it's probably going to have that structure. When you're crafting a story, you're going to get the chance to make choices about where do you want to stop, what and also, if your story isn't working as well as you'd like, how can I use that story structure knowledge to line it up with that, so that that inciting incident happens pretty soon, and so that the main event happens right towards the end, and so that we don't go too long after the thing, the main event. I sort of alluded to that quickly in the video. I'm just going to reiterate it because I think it's something I see people sometimes struggle with a lot, although it doesn't need to be a struggle, where they'll write a big thing happening in the story, the big thing, and they get it out and they say it, and then they just go on a little too long afterwards. And what happens for the audience just invariably is that as they go on, the audience starts to go, I thought that was the big thing, but there must be more. And then when there isn't more, it's not a happy thing. They're all like, oh, I got a little bored at the end, or I thought it was good and then it wasn't, or things like that. I've seen this happen. It's so funny in being in my theater background and in film and television. You more theater because it's happening live. You'll watch a play and it might have this incredible thing happen, but the playwright just overwrote it and they just wrote too long afterwards. And you'll watch audiences go from like completely in it, deeply moved. You look at them, tears are rolling down their faces. They're just so engaged. And then flash forward 10 minutes later, because it went on too long, they're like, shift, and all this stuff. And you're like, oh my gosh. And it was as simple as that. And, it just went on too long after the thing. Okay. So that was really a great question. Any other questions about the structure stuff? At this point, I'm hoping you're starting to get a sense that it's inherent to storytelling. It's not something that you have to necessarily think about, but it is, as I just said, a guideline, so that if you craft a story, because you're not telling it spontaneously, because you're taking time, you can start to, before you know it, get fancy. I'm thinking of, because I'm talking to a group of teachers, I'm thinking of all the, I'm thinking, I have two children. They're 19 and 22. But when they were younger, in some of their schools, they were unfortunately encouraged to just write things using basically length guidelines. Your story should be, 2 pages long. And they would write things, and pretty soon they were just basically writing filler. I'm sure you've all encountered this. And, I would see paragraphs like when they were quite little, things like, yesterday we went to the zoo. It was the day before today, and that's where we went. It was really a great zoo that we went to yesterday. Yesterday was such a good day because of the zoo trip. Like it was like, wow, that is filler central. And when you're story crafting and wanting to make things, have greater impact, that's one of the things you want to guard against, is that ideally there's no filler. It's everything becomes essential and useful in maximizing the impact of the whole thing, right? All right, great. So to be clear, the notion of using story structure as a guideline that would show up as follows. You write something, right? You try it out. That might be trying it out, telling it to people, or it might be trying it out, just reading it at home or reading it out loud or something. And you start to get some feedback, either internal feedback from yourself or feedback from people listening to the story. And if the feedback is telling you that something's amiss, this is not as good as it wants to be, and by good, I just mean impactful and engaging, right? And that feedback may come from behavioral cues, like I alluded to earlier, yawning and shifting and stuff like that. It might come from verbal prompts. Somebody might say like, that story's boring, which sadly are things I've heard before about things that I'm involved with. It's very usual at some point along the way to hear things like that. And then begs the question, so what do you do with that information? Well, you want to go back to your story and you want to make it better. And that's where the story structure guidelines come in, because you can look to see, where did it get boring? Where did people disengage? Where did they drift off? And a lot of times the reasons that those things are happening is because the structure is not as simple as it is when you look at it in the abstract form, like just looking at a picture, right? And what you might notice is that I waited way too long to get to the inciting incident. So for example, Chrissy, when I asked you to tell a story and you started to tell a story, you said, oh yeah, I got it. And then you ended up bailing on a story, as I would say, at first, because you were like, yeah, we went to Norway a lot, and just experienced a lot of things there, kind of, and it was great. It was like, those are happy times. And and that's basically, you're in the setup part, but we haven't gotten to the inciting incident. And so that would be an example of, if that were a story structure, you'd be looking and going, wow, that's all set up. There's just all set up there. Where's this inciting incident? Now, to get you to land on the inciting incident, I simply asked, was there anything particular that happened? And immediately you heard that and you went, yes, there was. And I said, well, think of one of those. You thought of one of those and you told us. And in doing so, all of a sudden, story structure comes into place. In a way, what you walked yourself through was the difference between describing a sort of a premise or thematic setting and telling a story. Stories are sharings of something that has happened. It could be a fictional thing, it could be a non-fictional thing, that doesn't matter. But it's really one of the ways, arguably, that you would define it as a story, because it's chronicling an event, right?
Can I ask you a question about pacing?
Yeah, of course.
So the timeline that you drew in the video, how is it different, or is it different for a story that's kind of delivered orally versus like a fiction novel?
I would suggest that it's not different at all. And that if you take a fictional novel or a non-fictional, is it proper to say non-fictional novel? I don't know if that's technically correct or not, but a bunch of teachers just went, yes. It's like, well, that's good. There you go. But if you take these novels in written form, the exact same rules apply. In other words, if I'm reading a book and I'm like, wow, cool world, and nothing happens, I would say the chances are, the odds go up, that I'm going to put the book down because something elsewhere is more interesting. On the other hand, if you hook them in right away with something, then there's some part of for the reader that goes, I want to stay with this because I want to figure out what's going to happen there. And so I would say if we were to look at any books that we all agreed were like, boy, that's a masterpiece, that's really good, you'd probably find The Inciting Incident is pretty darn quick.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So do you ever read a story or hear a story and think, this is breaking the rules and it works?
I would love to have that experience. I've never had it. Every time I've seen a story, and I found that in terms of rules is an unfortunate word, but in terms of this structure concept, I found that it just seems to always hold true. Now, to be clear, this picture, the model of that, is not a model of a narrative structure necessarily. And what I mean is, you could have something that fulfills that concept that doesn't narratively seem to follow that concept, but it still has something in it that early on is capturing your attention. In other words, you might find something, and sometimes the inciting incident is simply a complete change in writing tone or change in locale or something. It's like that feels so random. It's like, I'll make up one, but it would be like, Val and Jenny were walking on the beach, and they were looking at their daughter and just enjoying, what an incredible being she was blossoming into. I'm on a horse at 3:15 in the park, and I'm riding down the walkway, and literally just like that shift from, wait, we went to the beach to the horse, what's that about, might constitute something that makes people go like, whoop, I'm in, I got to find out what that is. That's not necessarily a narrative thing, but it is within the structure of the story. Y'all follow?
There's also like Pulp Fiction is like a movie that, despite the fact that it's not told chronologically, like still follows that structure.
Absolutely 100%.
Like despite the fact that it's not, doesn't sort of like the structure doesn't have to be like, the story could be non-linear, but still, regardless, you're always going to have, because you're telling it to people and you want people to pay attention, so you're still naturally following that structure overall, despite the fact that the moments could be non-linear.
That's absolutely right. And if you all find a story that you found compelling and you wonder like, gee, how does that line up with this story structure thing, by all means, we can talk about it, and assuming we all know the story, or enough of us do, yeah. But it just seems to be built into what stories are, and it makes sense to me because, well, we obviously are taking, when we tell a story, we're sort of taking attention. We're saying, everybody listen or look at me for a second. Or for some portion of time, I'm going to share something. So now we're engaged, like we have their attention. And it stands to reason that we would want to keep their attention. It would be a little bizarre if we said, everybody, I got something to tell you, and then everybody like looked away and didn't care, and we were like, whatever, that was all, that's all, like usually it's like, no, we have something to tell you. We want your attention. And I think because it's inherent to stories to want the people's attention, stories tend to be structured in some way that grabs people's attention early on. So that would be my thoughts on that, Sam. And if you think of something that you're wondering if it breaks the rules or not, like I said, we could certainly talk about. And also, this kind of story structure applies not to, I talked about it not always showing up with narrative structure. This sometimes applies to stories that have no words at all. They're completely stories showing up in the form, say, of dance or graphic art or architecture. They all have a way of like if you look for a story and there's one at all in there, it shows up and you'll see it.
All right, architecture.
Yeah.
You
You want an example?
Yeah.
Any of you been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C.? By show of hands, how many people have been to that museum? Okay, so this is only going to apply to half the group, but I'll try to get it across. I would argue that that building completely has a story structure. They also have designed the tour to support the story structure of the building, and they have designed the building to support the story structure of the tour. And in reading of the making of, they actually, you can read accounts where they'll talk about this. They're very aware of it. So I don't know what y'all experience was at the museum, but this was mine. I showed up, I made an appointment to go to the museum at a certain time of day. It was like 9 a.m. or something. And I showed up at 9 a.m. and they said, oh, great. Yeah, you can go stand in the line. And the line was, was at that point about 5 blocks long, you know, down and everything. And they gave me a passport. And it turns out they gave everybody as a visitor. And I don't know if you remember this, but when you visit that place, you're given a passport. And the passport is a picture of someone who is in some way involved in the Holocaust and a story / biography of that person, right? So I got mine and I'm waiting in line. And while I'm waiting in line, you're just waiting and you're going, I made an appointment. Why am I waiting in line? It's kind of weird. And you're sitting there in line and you're listening to all these people just in line, you know, and some of them are like, yeah, you know, this is how I've been looking forward to this for a long time. Some people are just talking about, oh, we had great pizza or whatever. And invariably somebody says, oh yes, I had, my great aunt was a survivor. And, you know, and you just kind of hear these stories that are both connected to just life as it is, and also life in the Holocaust. And you're getting closer and closer to the place. And then you get into the building. Okay, now when you go into the building, that line goes through the short entryway and you are funneled into an elevator. And when you get into the elevator in your group, they take people in groups of, and I don't know how many it is, I want to say 10, something like that. You get in the elevator and you are crammed. In fact, I'm sure it's by design that you're crammed in the way you might be in a train car that is packed with people. And when I was there, I don't know if they've changed this part of the exhibit, but when I was there, first thing you do, you go into this elevator, you're crammed in this tight space. The lights go out in the elevator and a video started above the elevator. And it's a British reporter who has just been, it was a documentary footage. He is just at a point where one of the concentration camps was liberated, and he is freaking out. The British reporter is very, very upset and kind of panicking. And he's looking at the camera and it's something like, he goes, it's not supposed to be this way. And then the doors open up and there's total silence and there's 2 pin spots highlighting 2 uniforms from concentration camps. They're just sitting against the wall. It's dead quiet and it says the Holocaust. And then you leave this tight thing and go into an area that's beginning to open up, right? That's the example of the beginning of the architectural inciting incident crammed into an elevator. What's that about? I'm paying attention. This is not the usual thing. Oh, there's a video. Oh, I'm supposed to look up and everything. We're now engaging into this whole experience in a different way that's really story motivated. And the structure of the building is supporting that. You follow? Okay. I don't want to take the time, but I could walk you through the whole journey of it because it fascinated me, and it's got everything, and it's got the point of return, and it's got the big main event, and it's got this incredible denouement thing at the end when they have the stories of heroism and this room that's it's like a white marble room. I don't know if any of you got a chance to go into that, where you just basically decompress, and it's, you know, that's the denouement part. It's got it all. Okay. So let's see if we can find some stories that we're all familiar with and pick out these story points. So ideally, we're looking for, let's start with either a movie or a play that we think we've all seen. There's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's 13 of us here right at the moment. Let's see if we can figure out something that we've all seen. Anybody got an idea? Anything will do. How about, I'll just from experience, I'll throw out some movies that I know a lot of people have seen. Wizard of Oz? Anybody not seen it? Everybody has seen The Wizard of Oz. Okay, good, we'll do that. Great. What's the setup part of The Wizard of Oz?
Kansas.
As a
Yep.
home, Kansas. Yeah.
Yep, Kansas,
Dorothy on the farm.
farm,
Mhm.
girl, yeah, all that stuff. Yeah,
Mhm.
great. And then something happens. What's the first thing that happens in the story where you go like, uh-oh, problem?
Storm.
Tornado.
Okay, so you all-
It's
you all
Gulch.
said- yeah, right, exactly. So you all said tornado, and that's a huge event, but actually that's about a third of the way into the film.
Ah,
Be very late, right? But there is something that happens almost immediately. And somebody called it out.
Miss
Which
Gulch.
kills her dog?
Right, what happens with the dog?
Oh, he runs away.
Well, before that even.
Doesn't he meet like the Wicked Witch basically? Like she's like that lady on the bike.
Yeah, that's Agnes Gulch, who's a neighbor. And what's the deal? What does Agnes Gulch do?
Gets the note with the order to put the dog down for biting her.
That's right. She says, I'm gonna kill your
Oh.
dog.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Bum, bum,
oh, I
bum.
forgot.
Right away. There's your inciting-
A long time.
there's your inciting incident. Oh my gosh, they're gonna kill the dog. That's terrible,
It's horrible.
right?
I forgot. Yeah.
Now that, as I mentioned, the tornado is a huge event. It's just that it's one of many huge events.
Mhm.
When you're looking for the inciting incident, you're looking for the first one. There it is. All right. Now we've identified so far the setup and the inciting incident. Let's go for the climax of the main event, and then we'll cycle back to get the point of no return. What's the climax, the main event of The Wizard of Oz? What are your theories? What do you got?
Wizard.
She throws the
I'm sorry that we got clipped in Zoom. Someone say that again.
The wizard is revealed.
Okay, one thing would be the reveal of the wizard, and by that you're talking about, I think you're talking about the scene where Toto goes and pulls the curtain and we see the man behind the curtain and we find out he's not a wizard. Okay, great. So that's one theory. Any other theories as to what the main event of The Wizard of Oz is?
The house falls on, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Right.
The house falls on the Wicked Witch of the West.
One theory would be the house falling on the Wicked Witch of the, is it the East? I
It's
think
the East or West, the East, which
See-
enrages the Wicked Witch of the West.
it does, yeah. So that's a theory too. Any other theories as to the big thing that happens, the climactic event? Of the
Well, there's the big battle with the Wicked Witch of the West.
There's the battle with the Wicked Witch of the West when she dies. Yeah, so there's that. Yeah, that's another theory. Any other theories?
In the climax, there's no place like home, like the slippers.
What happens? Yeah, what happens in that part?
She like sets her intention and she finally has the power. She has everything she needs. And bye, friends. Flip the slippers.
Yeah.
Go.
Yeah, so yes, I'm going to fill that out. There's even more to it than that. So what happens is she's stuck in Oz and the good witch comes down and she's freaked out, she's crying and she's like, I'll never get home to Kansas. And the good witch comes down and says, Dorothy, you've had the power all along. And she's, she cries and says, and then the good witch says, yes, all you need to do is click your heels 3 times and say, there's no place like home, there's no place like home, no place like home. Dorothy does it, teleports home, and wakes up in Kansas. That's what that's that part. That's that scene. Okay, great. So we have 3 theories or 3 or 4 theories out on the table right now of what the main event would be. Now, that thing in the video where you look for identifiers, that's how you check. You go like, well, wait, and let's start with which one of those is closest to the end.
The slippers.
Totally. Her going home to Kansas. So you can we'll go through those. Now, is there a big change in the course of action at that point in the story?
She goes from one place to another.
Yeah, one is she was in
Location change.
The location change. She was in Oz, or now she's in Kansas. Any other changes at that part of the story?
She goes from color back to black and white.
It goes from color to black and white. That's right. The filmmakers were helping you. They were going like, this is big. So yes, it's that. How about, is there a reveal at that part of the story? Is something made known to a character?
The lion was that guy, and the witch was her, and the Tin Man is that guy. Like you pick.
So there's a little bit of that reveal going on. Anything else? Any other reveals?
Well, the big reveal is that Dorothy didn't need any of the other things. It's her, right? It's that.
Yeah, she had the power all along. We did not know that. Dorothy did not know that. It's a huge reveal for sure. So it's got reveals. Is there an extreme physical event at that point?
She wakes up.
Yeah.
She comes
Clicks her
to.
heels.
Right.
Yeah, teleportation and space is like that's a big event. So it's got a physical thing. Is there what are the other things? Is there the big one? Could you end the story before then and it would be the same story?
No, she'd
No.
be stuck in Oz.
She'd be stuck in Oz. It
No.
would be this tragic tale of this girl who got stuck in Oz.
Mhm.
Yeah, you need that part for sure. Okay. Now there's one other identifier which is not on the list but since we're looking at a whole story, you can include this too. And that is if the story has a title, there often is a connection between the main event or climax and the title. Let's look for it here. The title of this is The Wizard of Oz. Is there a connection between this scene and the title, The Wizard of Oz?
Yeah.
What's
She
the
was for almost the whole movie, they'd been pinning their hopes to the wizard solving their problems, and they all found out that they had the solution within them.
So that's one thing. That's one thing is that, wow, there's this shift from we're not wizard oriented anymore necessarily, we're self-oriented, right? Or Dorothy. So there's that. Yeah. Good. Any other connections that anybody noticed?
Even the character's name, it's Professor Marvel and then a wizard. So it's kind of like connected that way with this idea of like magic and the ability.
Well, I'm gonna point out something. We in the scene where Toto pulls the curtain back, we actually find out that he's not a wizard. He's a guy who just called themselves the Grand and Glorious Oz. The whole wizard thing was something that other people attributed. Who's the wizard? I'll point. Also, I'm going to help you with this one. At the beginning of her quest to get back home from Kansas, when she's asking, how will I get home to Kansas? Glinda the Good Witch says, the Wizard of Oz has an idea of how to get you home. That's the direct quote from the film. Who's the wizard?
Dorothy.
Yes, thank you very much. Dorothy is the Wizard of Oz. If you watch the film again, look for that line and you'll see it and go like, oh my God, who knew? Dorothy's the Wizard of Oz. Mind's blown. There's a connection, right? These lists of identifiers, as we just did here, are just techniques, ways to kind of go through a story. And if you think, I think that's it, ask those identifiers and see if it satisfies a lot of the identifiers. If it does, chances are you're at the main event, okay? This one seems to satisfy all of them on that list. Now, if that's the main event, what's the point of no return? You would back up before the story and go, wait, what happened just before all that happened?
The wizard being revealed to be a fraud?
Well, that did happen before it, but not just before it. Just before it, something happened. It's what made the Good Witch come down. What? Yeah, we'll say it again.
He floats away on the balloon.
That's right. The balloon takes off without Dorothy. Now she is stuck. It's literally a point of no return in this case, right? She cannot get back. And that happens right. That's exactly what causes the Good Witch to come down. Toto sees a cat, jumps out of the balloon takes off. Dorothy's crying and the Good Witch comes down and lets her know all this stuff. Now, you may have noticed that the events, the climax is not actually just a single event in this case, but a cluster of events. And this is often the case. Often things will happen in groups like that. You might have a story where there's a singular thing that happens in your own stories, maybe this way, or you might have a story where a bunch of things happen at once, right? And that's just something to be on the lookout. But what allows you to think of them as a single event is in the timeline of the story, they all happen right around the same part. If there's a bunch of time being taken in between these things happening, that's not a single event anymore. Those are different events you're describing. Okay, so we got all of them except for the denouement. What's the denouement in The Wizard of Oz? The big event is she comes home, gets home on her own power. What's the denouement?
You were there, and you were there.
That's right. It's at the end of the film, which is like 70 seconds long. It's really short. That's it. And remember when on the video I talked about the strings? Perfect example. She's there, she wakes up and the strings start playing Somewhere Over the Rainbow and all this stuff. It's like big old strings. Okay, so that was an example of finding something that we all know, looking at story structure, and oh, there it is, right? So your assignment is, as you craft whatever you're crafting to bring in on this 3-minute things, look at your stories and sort of compare them with just general story structure. See what you notice. See if your inciting incident. First of all, have an inciting incident, right? And then make sure it happens pretty quick. And sometimes in stories, they happen so fast that it's kind of astonishing. You all know the story of the film It's a Wonderful Life?
Mm-hmm.
Show of hands, how many people have seen It's a Wonderful Life? Okay, that's everybody. I think that was everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I love it. That's okay, inciting incident of It's a Wonderful Life. It happens 12 seconds in, that's a big hint. What is it? I'll walk you up to it. First thing you see, the credits is playing Christmas music. You see a sign that it pushes in on a sign. It says, "You are now in Bedford Falls." That's the setup. Mm-hmm. And you see snow, and you see like an overhead shot of a sleepy northeastern town, and then something happens.
Does the star talk?
It's before the stars. That's part of the cluster, but it's the first thing that happens.
I mean, isn't it about he's like on the verge of killing himself, right?
Yeah,
like,
how do we
the setup, right? Like he's
in the story, how do we know that? What happens that tells us tonight that that's happening?
On a bridge.
There are a bunch of prayers that we hear. We hear a story of prayer.
Okay.
Oh.
Dear God, help George Bailey. He's a good guy. You know, George is a great guy. Please help Mr. Bailey. You know, there's all these different things. You know, something's wrong with Daddy. There's just all these things. And right away we go like, something is up. There's your inciting incident. We now have to see what's going to happen, and then we, you know, go to outer space and watch some angels in the form of stars talking to each other, and we kind of go like, oh, that's what's up, and we slowly find out all sorts of things in the story, right? So inciting incidents can happen right away. In your stories you craft, look to have one right away. When you get to the climactic thing, the big thing that happens at the end, look to make sure it's like, is it close to the end? Is something changing now? Is there some kind of reveal? There won't always be an extreme physical event. There doesn't need to be. That's just, a lot of them have that. And your stories won't necessarily have titles, so you don't have to worry about that at all. And basically craft something and then, you know, measure it against that story structure thing, and then come in and share it, and then we'll kind of, you know, tweak it and do some stuff with it. Everybody, does that all feel clear?
Is the idea that we are actually writing out a full script, or is it that we're sort of thinking through like, these are the beats, like just in terms of like what we should come in with next time?
Yeah, it is entirely optional. It is up to you. Some writers write out every word. Some writers do something that akin to a bullet point synopsis. They just like have a little cheat sheet that says, this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens. And then they'll ad-lib it. And you're welcome to do that. You do not need to write out every word, but you might want to. That's totally up to you. Performatively, there's something nice about not writing out every word, frankly. So, you know, you might try that option just so you have the performance experience of it, because it's looser, it's more spontaneous and all that stuff, right? But I would definitely lay out the bullet points of it, just so you're not just completely, you know, winging it, but you have thought through some structure. And of course, when you tell a story, you're not going to be identifying these things for us. You're not going to go like, and then here's the inciting incident, blah, blah. You're not going to do that. You just tell us the story. That
But
you
also, Seth, they have to be aware of time.
That's right. It should be 3 minutes, no longer. That'll allow us to, you'll come in, we're gonna be working with everybody in 12-minute slots, roughly. It'll allow you to tell your story. That's 3 minutes, probably take us, a minute of prologue to get to that. And that'll give us a good 7 to 8 minutes of time for us to dig in and talk about, the story and dissect it a bit, come up with possible.
Should it be fictional or non-fictional, or do you not care?
I do not care. Perfect. Whatever you want.
Just good.
I don't even care about that. I trust that you all have things about that.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Seth.
Theme-wise, does it matter? You're in any story?
Any story, yeah.
It should somehow relate to school, and if it doesn't, it should relate to that it happened to you as a teacher. Somehow or other, you have to reference yourself. Your teacherness should be connected to the story. That's why it's called Stories Out of School. We're trying to inspire teachers to think about the wonderful, world you inhabit and the experiences that you have in school. We're trying to give voice to that. So that's why we focus these things on school-based stories. But
I think it's great, and I have a strong sense that as you reflect on your experience, you're going to have something happen along the way. You're like, oh my God, there's this thing.
Yeah.
That either happened to you in a classroom, or it happened to you when you were a student, or it happened, just in, as Sam said, in some way in relationship to your teacherness.
Yeah. Yeah, no, teachers have the best stories. You guys have a lot of stories to tell. So just pick a good one that you like to tell.
Yeah. All right, great. Well, thank you so much for your time. This is fantastic. And I look forward to hearing the stories that you're going to be sharing.